Welcome back to the channel. I'm Traben, and in today's video, we're going to be looking at Ms. Marvel, the New Mutant. I've debated a bit about how much detail I want to go into the history of Ms. Marvel and the controversy surrounding this comic in particular, and the things that have happened to Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, in the recent past. I definitely feel like it's something that needs to be addressed, if only to give some context into what all this comic had to do to impress me. Last year, Marvel had the brilliant idea of killing off Ms. Marvel, not within her own title, but within a Spider-Man title. This decision came at a really odd time. The Ms. Marvel Disney Plus series had recently ended, and while it was one of the least well-received series they've done so far, it was just a weird choice to kill off the character in the comic that you're establishing in your movie franchises. It also occurred right as The Marvels was being announced and was soon to be in theaters. There's an awful lot of controversy surrounding this death for a number of different reasons, both very serious and, your typical comic book issues, your comic book problems. The major offense was that they were killing off the most well-known Pakistani superhero in a comic book that she had no connection to up to that point, to further the story of Peter Parker. Seems like weak motivation to kill off a fairly popular character. In addition to that, because of some of the events in the series in which it was hinted that for the MCU, Ms. Marvel was a mutant as opposed to an Inhuman, as she is in the comics. There was speculation early on when the death of Ms. Marvel was announced that they were going to bring her back as a mutant and have her powers more align with the MCU version, in which she has energy projection powers rather than her embiggening powers in the comics. A lot of these rumors turned out to be true. Ms. Marvel's death in the comics lasted 8 weeks real time, and I think 3 days, 2 or 3 days in comic book time. At this point, pretty much everybody's memory of Ms. Marvel's death has been erased, so they've literally erased this event, even though they made a big deal about it when it happened. And she has indeed been brought back as a mutant, which a lot of people had some issues with. To a certain extent, whether Ms. Marvel is a mutant or an Inhuman is a pretty irrelevant conversation. The two groups are fairly similar in a lot of their thematic messaging and in their power sets. But the fact is that Ms. Marvel was created at a time when Marvel did not have the film rights to the X-Men and was pushing the Inhumans both in the comic books and in television and film as a way of having mutants without being able to have Wolverine and the X-Men. This push to make Ms. Marvel a mutant was seen as a really transparent corporate decision and not one really motivated by character. In addition to that, many people felt like making Ms. Marvel a mutant wasn't going to add much to her story. She's already, because of her heritage and because of being an Inhuman, she's already experienced a lot of the core thematic issues that the X-Men are known for portraying. She's already seen as an outcast. She's already dealt with bigotry. She's already dealt with isolation, being labeled an outlaw, a vigilante, etc. And so it didn't seem like folding her into the X-Men and into mutants was going to add a lot story-wise for the character. I explain all this just to give some context into my thought process going into this comic. I have followed Miss Marvel's comics since the very beginning. I've read through all of the 2 volumes of the comics that precede this. I've read through a lot of the offshoots and the one-shots that they've released, and watched the TV show, seen the Marvels. Miss Marvel is, at this point, my favorite superhero comic. And so I had a lot of trepidation in the changes that were being made to the character and was wary of picking this up. But I promised myself that I would get it if I heard good things about the comic. And fortunately, all the reviews have been fairly positive. And so when this collection got released, I picked it up. I'm happy to say that it's a really solid issue. It's a really solid comic. And if you have any interest in Miss Marvel or in X-Men, I think it's a decent jumping on point. Let's talk about some of the positive things, some of the good things that's come from this new volume and this new direction. We'll talk about some of the problems that making Kamala a mutant has created for the story as well. Marvel made the very shrewd decision to make Iman Vallani the author of the story. So Iman Vallani, for those who don't know, is the actress who portrays Miss Marvel in the TV show and in the Marvels movie. She is a super huge fan of Marvel Comics in general, and that attitude goes a long way in embodying Miss Marvel as a character, who is also a super fan of the superheroes in the Marvel community. She writes fan fiction. She is obsessed with Captain Marvel at the beginning of the story. And she just loves teaming up with new characters and finding out more about the world and these different people that inhabit it. And so that joy, because Iman Vallani is also a fan of Marvel Comics, that joy is transferred to that character. And I know when the Marvels came out, again, to kind of underwhelming reviews, Iman Vallani was pointed out in multiple reviews that I looked at as the shining point of that film, and her enthusiasm and her energy really doing a lot to carry that film. So there is a co-writer for the book, and it's unclear exactly how much input each had within the story, but I feel like the core of Miss Marvel and the storytelling that we've been getting from this character and from these series is evident, especially toward the end of this book. Very positive thing about it is it's being written by someone who cares about the character and cares about the continuity, knows the ins and outs of the character and what's going on, and so is able to bring that same energy and bring those same themes and the same ideas into this new status quo. I also appreciate that the comic does not shy away from some of the issues that people had with the concept of Miss Marvel being a mutant. What I gather from the comic, Miss Marvel is a mutant whose mutant power has never manifested. So she's identifying as an X-Men, she's identifying as a mutant, but nothing about her power set has changed. They did not go the route of trying to make the energy projections a thing and to align this more with the MCU depiction of the character. There is a little bit of an issue with pulling Kamala into a wider part of the MCU and making her a mutant and making her an X-Men. It broadens the scope of the comic, and to reflect that, in this comic, Kamala is moving from Jersey, which is where she normally is operating and is protecting, into New York City proper. You get a much bigger sense of the interconnectedness of this story with other things that are going on in Marvel. And if you're not the kind of person who enjoys that, or you're not the kind of person who follows other comics, that might be a little off-putting. I don't follow a lot of other comics, and I was able to understand what was being said here and know that I'm missing out on a little bit of information, I'm missing out on some context, but they do a good job of catching you up and giving you the most important aspects of what's going on in the larger story for you to follow what's going on in here. But that is just a minor thing that you might want to be aware of going into it, that it does reference the other runs of Miss Marvel. It does reference the Hellfire Club mini series that saw Miss Marvel be resurrected, and it does reference the Spider-Man comic where she died. So if you're not aware of these things, then that might be a little bit off-putting. It also addresses the complaint that her being a mutant does not add anything new to the character, and it's discussed kind of in an offhand way. There was a conversation between her and Emma Frost, another mutant, that being a mutant is different than what she's experienced before. Mutants are seen as like universally hated right now in the Marvel continuity, and it is being hated for what people assume you're going to do, for like appearing superior to humanity. Emma Frost argues that it's on a different level than what Kamala's experienced before. Whether or not you want to believe that is up to you. Like, that's up to interpretation. But I appreciate that the comic at least addressed it within the story. And indeed, within the comic, she does experience that idea of just how vitriolic the hatred towards the X-Men and towards mutants are. She tries to save this bus full of people, and they're immediately like, oh, it's a mutant, we hate her, she's terrible, get away from her, she tried to kill us, she's trying to hurt us. And she really does struggle, despite her history, despite all the other things she's gone through, with just how angry people are with her, and how just seeing the iconography on her costume is getting them so upset. I think, by the way, this is probably a misstep. Like, you know that people hate mutants right now. Why would you put the X's on your uniform and have, I don't know if it's visible here, yeah, have the X on your belt buckle and on the shoulder pads? Like, what's the purpose? It does a good job of explaining how the stakes of being a mutant are different than what she's experienced before. And we do get to a point where at least some characters are brought over to her side. The story itself, at its core, is struggling with this idea of identity. It starts off with a nightmare sequence where Kamala is coming face to face with all these former groups that she's been a part of. So is she a champion? Is she an Inhuman? Is she a mutant? Is she something else? To make the idea of identity and who you are a core facet of the comic, I think was another really shrewd move in bringing up the complaints and the concerns that a readership who's familiar with this character is going to have with these new changes. Ultimately, the messaging here is that you get to decide how you define yourself. Like, you're not defined by your powers or even by the community you identify with. You can be your own individual person, and that's very much in line with the messaging from previous Miss Marvel comics. What I found particularly interesting and really worked for me was that the supporting cast around Kamala was still given a lot of deference within this comic. This was a big thing for Miss Marvel runs in the past, of the support structure around her, her friends and family. That support she has from those around her is a very key point for a lot of these comics. And within this, the climax of the issue does really work with that idea that the everyday people that she's with are just as important and just as integral to her story as her as a superhero. I really enjoyed the art within this comic. I felt it did a good job of aging up the character a little bit, making her seem a little bit more mature and a little bit more self-assured. I also, again, really appreciated the appearance of other superheroes within the story and these former relationships she's had still playing a role in her story moving forward. Iman Vallani has a good sense of who this character is supposed to be and is capable of writing her even in a very controversial time where it was going to be a very tricky proposition to bring this character back amid all this controversy and do her justice and still give a compelling story that at its heart gives the same feelings and the same impressions we are used to from a Miss Marvel property. I really wasn't sure how I was going to feel about this one. Even from the positive reviews of what I had seen online, I wasn't sure where I was going to wind up. I think it's to the writer's credit to say that they really threaded a needle here in creating that story where you still have the heart and the soul of the previous incarnations, that you introduce these new concepts that the higher ups want to incorporate into the story, but do so in a way that's not insulting to the character, doesn't change anything about the core of the character, and takes these more controversial issues that had to be juggled within the story and create a story that is still very much in line with the tone and the mood of previous entries. I gave Miss Marvel, the New Mutant, a 5 out of 5. I think that if you are a fan of Miss Marvel and you've been on the fence about this particular title because of the controversy surrounding her death and resurrection and her status as a mutant, that you do well to still pick this up. It has a lot of the same feelings of early Miss Marvel, the strongest Miss Marvel stories that we've had in the past. And even if you aren't familiar with everything that's going on with this character, if you are interested in this title, if you're interested in this character, I don't think this is a terrible jumping on point. I would argue that the original Wilson run is probably the best jumping on point for understanding this character, but it's not bad. It's just that, again, because they're pulling her into the larger universe of Marvel, there is a little bit of that like comic book integrated feeling. There are going to be some things that are referenced that you just have to go with the flow and move past so you can get this amazing story about identity and bigotry and overcoming adversity. And that's going to do it for this review. Please let me know down below what your thoughts are on Miss Marvel, on comic books in general. What do you follow? What are you really into? As always, like, comment, subscribe, feed that algorithm, and I hope your reading journey is going well. Until the next one, take care.